It started with a knock on the door at 4 a.m. A man claimed he was a police officer and that their close friend had been in a terrible accident. Only wanting to know more about their friend's condition, Jane Mackle quickly opened the door but immediately regretted the decision when the man rushed into the room with a partner and tied her up. They weren't there for her, though. They were looking for her daughter Barbara Mackle, who they would abduct and hold for ransom. Not in a room or a storage unit, but Barbara would spend 83 hours in a box underground. This is Monsters. We're going to put you in an underground room. You'll get air through a battery. The battery will last 7 days. If you use the light, the battery will only last 5 days. You'll be underwater. We'll check on you every 2 hours to make sure you aren't trying to escape. If you try to get out, you'll drown. Barbara was reeling from all the information she was being bombarded with. One of the kidnappers was rambling on about a fan, a life support system, and amperage per hour. Barbara had no idea what he was talking about. Confused and disoriented, she wanted to escape. She wanted to run, but he had tied her feet together so she couldn't. Sobbing, she begged to be put in the house. She promised not to fight, but the man said his boss would be mad if he didn't put her underground. What did that mean? She didn't understand. The other kidnapper, a smaller woman, spoke up. She told Barbara not to worry, she would check on her every 2 hours. They took anything that Barbara had that was metal, like a safety pin on her pajamas and the one ring she had on. They forgot about her watch, and she managed to slide it up her arm enough to hide it under the sleeve of her nightgown. The kidnappers used chloroform to knock Barbara out, but she was still semi-conscious. As the man pulled her out of the car, he found the watch on her arm and took it. Then he laid her on a blanket on the ground, put a sign on her that read, "Kidnapped," and took a picture. In the first picture, her eyes were closed, and he was worried that her parents would think she was dead. He told her to open her eyes and smile, so she did. The second picture was better, he said. He picked Barbara up and carried her a few feet away and then set her down on the edge of a hole. The young woman wasn't able to fully recognize her surroundings, so when he told her to slide down into the hole, she did. Then he told her to lay flat. As soon as Barbara realized where she was being placed, she began screaming, "No, no, no, you can't do this." The kidnapper just responded, "Don't be such a baby. Like a grown adult should just be okay with being buried alive, right?" Then the top was put on and screwed into place. Barbara yelled frantically for them to stop, but it was no use. Once the top was screwed on, the man talked through the box and gave her more instructions. He told her the switch for the fan was behind her head. She reached back and found 2 switches. One worked the fan and one worked the light. When she flipped on the fan, it made noise, but she wasn't sure if it was working. She yelled that it was broken, but the kidnapper responded that it was fine. Then she heard dirt start falling onto the top of the box, like sporadic rainfall as the pebbles scattered across the wooden lid. Inside, the sound of dirt falling on the box became more and more muffled until she was left with nothing but silence. With the light on, she would see that she was in a coffin-like box, just big enough for her to lay down flat. There was a container full of water inside the box. It had a tube that went from the container to up near her head, acting as a straw so she could drink. Barbara came to the terrifying realization that she was buried alive. In Decatur, Georgia, Jane Mackle sat on the bed in room 137. Outside, the sign read, "Roadway Inns of America. Solid comfort and old-fashioned hospitality." 2 DeKalb County police officers had responded to the room in response to a report of a kidnapping on December 17, 1968. Jane proceeded to tell the officers what had just happened. Her daughter, Barbara Mackle, was 20 years old and a student at Emory University, but was one of the many students who fell victim to the 1968 flu pandemic. Due to the amount of students who had fallen ill, she wasn't able to get a bed in the university clinic, so her mother traveled to Georgia from Florida and checked them both into a motel room where Jane was going to help Barbara recover. They had checked into the Roadway Inn on the 13th of December, about 4 days earlier. Once settled in, Jane called Barbara and had her drive to the motel in her olive green 1967 Pontiac Firebird. When Barbara got to the motel, she had a temperature of 101. While recovering at the Roadway Inn, Barbara was also studying for her finals. She was upset that she had lent her economics notes to another student and he had failed to return them. On Saturday the 14th, the phone in the room rang and someone said they had a registered letter for Barbara Mackle. The man's voice said that he was holding it for her at Barbara's dorm. It was late, so they planned to pick it up the next day. Jane believed that Barbara's economic notes must have been sent back to her by the student she lent them to. Barbara was relieved that she would be able to finish studying for her finals. Stuart Woodward was a good friend of Barbara's who also attended Emory University where he was studying business. He volunteered to stop by the dorm on Saturday to pick up Barbara's notes, and when he arrived, he was handed a red notebook containing them. When he brought them to the motel the following day, nobody questioned that they were not packaged as a delivery. Stuart spent the next 2 days helping Barbara study, and when he left on Monday the 16th, he said, "Well, don't talk to any strange men," which was what he normally said upon exit. It normally garnered a chuckle. Then he got into his white Ford and drove away. That night, both Barbara and Jane had trouble sleeping. By then, Jane was also showing signs of illness, and it was keeping both of them awake. In the early morning hours of December 17th, Jane was startled by a knock on the motel room door at about 4 a.m. Jane asked who it was, and a man's voice answered, "The police." The voice went on to explain that a young man in a white Ford had been in an accident. He was at the hospital and was asking for her. Jane clarified, "Stuart Woodward?" and the man confirmed. Jane slowly opened the door, and when she got a glimpse of a police cap on the man's head, she relaxed and opened it the rest of the way. Immediately, the man, who wasn't disguised at all, rushed into the room. He was followed by a much smaller person wearing a ski mask. The two people overpowered Jane and Barbara. The smaller one began tying Jane's wrists and ankles, and she said at that point she thought it might have been a young boy, about 12 or 13. Then they pressed a cloth of chloroform over her face. It takes a few minutes for chloroform to work. It's not like the movies where you take one whiff and you're immediately out. Jane realized that her best option was to pretend to pass out, so she did. Then the smaller assailant put a piece of tape over her mouth and ran out. The bigger one picked up Barbara and carried her outside. Jane saw a glimpse of Barbara's red and white nightgown leaving the room and began to panic. What were they planning to do with their daughter? She rolled off the bed and onto the phone and managed to knock the phone off the hook, but she couldn't dial the numbers. Pulling herself to her feet, she ran out of the room and, since the tape on her mouth was already falling off, began screaming for help. Nobody responded. She hopped her way to Barbara's Firebird, tripping and cutting her knees in the process. She managed to get the door open and lunged inside, pressing on the car's powerful horn with her chin. The loud noise caused one of the motel patrons to wake up and call the front desk. Finally, the motel's night manager came outside and told Jane to quiet down. Jane released the horn and yelled that her daughter had been kidnapped. The manager was hesitant to get involved, but he did agree to cut the cord around her wrists. Finally, Jane was able to go back into her room and call the DeKalb County Police herself. By the time the police had arrived, Jane had called Stuart and asked if he had been in an accident. He hadn't. The attackers had used it as a way to get her to open the door. Stuart ran to his car and immediately drove to the motel. The police questioned the young man and were immediately suspicious. In 1968, having a man and a woman be best friends was not considered normal. They also wanted to know how the kidnappers knew he drove a white Ford. Then, when they asked him if he knew any reason why someone would take Barbara, he quickly suggested ransom. The police thought he came to that conclusion too quickly, though. Stuart explained that the Mackle family was wealthy, but they weren't from the area, so police didn't know anything about their status. At the end of the day, authorities would end up keeping Stuart under surveillance. Barbara's father, Robert Mackle, was still in Florida, but he wasn't at home. He was at the Key Biscayne Hotel and Villas, which he and his brothers built in 1953 and had owned ever since. Robert and his brothers were one of the largest property developers in the Miami area and were worth an ungodly amount of money in 1968. When Stewart called Robert and told him what was happening, Robert directed the young man to call the FBI. One of Robert's good friends was J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. Robert flew to Atlanta and was soon at the motel. Once the FBI arrived, the situation began running more smoothly. The local police weren't equipped to handle a case of this magnitude and complexity. They set up a base of operation at the motel because that's where the kidnapping had taken place. They assumed that the kidnappers would make contact there in room 137 in the event of a ransom, but the phone never rang. Instead, at 9:10 a.m., the phone rang at the Mackle house in Miami. An employee answered the phone, and the man on the line asked if he was Robert Mackle. The employee let the caller know that Robert had gone to Atlanta. The caller said to look under a palm tree in the northeast corner of the house, under a rock about 6 inches down. Then he hung up. The employee relayed the message to Robert, and they sent an FBI agent to the house in Miami. When they dug under the tree, they found a beaker buried in the soil. Inside was a ransom note. It was 3 sheets of paper, typed, double-spaced on the first page, but single-spaced on the other 2. It began, "Robert Mackle, Sir, your daughter has been kidnapped by us, and we now hold her for ransom." The lengthy ransom letter explained that Barbara was safe but somewhat uncomfortable. They explained that the proof that they had her would be arriving in the mail soon. They said that Barbara was buried in a small capsule in a remote piece of soil and that she had enough food, water, and air to last 7 days. They asked for $500,000, just over $4 million today, in $20 bills. The bills were not to be older than 1950, not to have consecutive serial numbers, have no type of markings, and not have anything added such as chemicals or radiation. The cash was to be placed in a large suitcase, and when it was ready, Robert was supposed to place a personal ad in all Miami area newspapers that read, "Loved one, please come home. We will pay all expenses and meet you anywhere at any time. Your family." Once the ad appeared in the paper, they would call Robert after midnight and advise him of where to drop the money. He was required to deliver the money himself, wear a white suit, and drive his Lincoln when he did so. The message said that if these directions weren't followed precisely, they would discontinue communication and never release the location of Barbara, resulting in her suffocation. They stated that, if they were caught, they would also never reveal her location. It was important to note that Barbara was kidnapped at 4 a.m. in Decatur, and the ransom was located at the Mackle residence about 700 miles away at 9 a.m. It was a 10-hour drive, so either the ransom letter had been there for a while, or there were multiple people working together in multiple locations. Robert traveled back to Miami, where he had no problem getting $500,000 in cash. He placed a personal ad in all of the area newspapers, and then they waited. The ad was published in December 18th's morning newspapers. Every minute that passed after midnight was excruciating. With every tick of the clock, Robert imagined his daughter dead at the hands of these ruthless kidnappers. At 3:47 a.m. on December 19th, the phone at the Mackle home finally rang. The man on the line gave Robert directions to a causeway, and Robert asked how he knew that his daughter was still alive. The kidnapper responded, "You don't." The instructions were for Robert to drive to a secluded area and put the suitcase of money into a box and then back out of the area. Robert followed the instructions precisely, and the drop should have been a success. Except that it wasn't. The FBI didn't tell the local authorities in Miami what was going on because they thought they'd leak the story to the press. So after the drop, the kidnapper, armed with a gun, picked up the suitcase and was walking away from the drop site. 2 police officers saw him, thought he looked suspicious, and attempted to stop him. As soon as they pulled up, the man dropped the suitcase and ran into the woods. The officers opened the suitcase and were shocked to find that it was filled with cash. FBI agents heard over the radio that police had chased a suspicious character and recovered a suitcase filled with money. They knew immediately that the ransom drop had gone sideways. The suitcase was now locked in evidence at the Miami Police Department. The Mackles were completely distraught. They were sure that Barbara would be killed. Robert put another personal ad in the papers that stated he was not involved with the police and he was still willing to pay. All he could do now was wait and hope that the kidnappers were desperate enough for the money that they would give him another chance. When the police chased the kidnapper, he had been walking from the drop location to his car. When police canvassed the area, they found a 1966 Volvo station wagon with Massachusetts license plates. The FBI informed the Miami police of their kidnapping case and recovered the suitcase in the car. When they searched the car, they found rope, tape, and a ski mask. They also found a key to the Roadway Motel where the abduction took place. In the back seat, they found photos of a man in his 20s. In one of them, he's nude besides a police cap covering his genitals. FBI forensic technicians vacuumed the car to pick up any fibers that could lead them to the identity of the kidnapper. They also took prints from all over the car. When the car registration was run, the owner came back as a man named George Deacon. The Mackle family didn't recognize the man in the picture or the name. The identity came back with no criminal record. While the FBI was scouring the Miami area for George Deacon, the kidnapper called the Mackle residence and gave Robert a new drop point. This time it would be an unpaved road on the edge of town. The first thing the FBI did was to contact all local authorities and tell them to stay the hell away. They did not need a repeat of the last money drop. Robert put on his white suit, got into his Lincoln, and drove to the drop location where he left the suitcase and returned home. He and the Mackle family waited by the phone for days, but it remained silent. Investigators discovered that George Deacon worked at the University of Miami Institute of Marine Science. When they interviewed his boss, they learned that he had been hired in June to pilot boats for research. Then they learned that part of his job was to build ventilated boxes to put specimens in. His boss told agents that he was close with a post-grad student who also worked there named Ruth Eismann-Schier. She was described as being small, barely 5 feet tall, with a heavy Spanish accent. The FBI also learned that a man had just bought an enclosed trailer from George for $35. The man said he didn't really want the thing, but he couldn't pass it up for only $35. He said that George was in a real hurry to get rid of it. When the trailer was searched, investigators found letters addressed to George Deacon, but also others addressed to Gary Krist. When they did a background check on Gary Krist, they found that he had a lengthy criminal record for theft. He had actually escaped from prison in 1966 and had been on the run for years. They compared the fingerprints from the car to the prints on file for Gary and came back with a match. George Deacon was Gary Krist, their kidnapper, and Ruth Eismann-Schier was his accomplice. Gary Krist was born in Alaska in 1945 and eventually moved to the lower 48. He began getting in trouble with the law at the age of 14 before being sent to prison in California. He escaped prison in 1966 and started using the identity George Deacon. He made his way to Florida where he got a job at the University of Miami Institute of Marine Science using forged credentials. It was there that he met Ruth, who quickly fell in love with the criminal and con man. Ruth was born in Honduras in 1942 and went to the National University of Mexico where she graduated and began attending the University of Miami. After she started dating Gary, he convinced her that they could score a bunch of money and run away together. He explained that all they had to do was kidnap the child of a wealthy family and put them up for ransom. They didn't have to hurt anyone, and the parents would easily pay to get their child back. The pair began researching who their target would be, and they found out that Robert Mackle, the wealthy real estate developer, had a daughter who was attending Emory University outside of Atlanta. They devised a plan to drive up there, kidnap her from her dorm, and put her up for ransom. Gary constructed a box just like the ones he built at the Marine Science Center, only bigger. He wired a fan and a light to a battery and loaded it into an enclosed trailer. The couple drove to a secluded area outside of Atlanta where they dug a trench and placed the makeshift casket underground. They spent a few days watching Barbara and learned that she had left the dorm and was staying with her mother at the Roadway Inn. Their first attempt at kidnapping Barbara was to call her room at the motel and claim there was a delivery waiting for her. Their goal was to lure her to the parking lot where they could snatch her, but she didn't take the bait. Instead, they went for a direct approach. Having seen Stewart frequently at the motel in his white Ford, Gary stole a police hat from an officer in a cafe and used it to talk his way into the room. At 12:47 p.m. on December 20th, the operator at the FBI's Atlanta field office received a call from Gary Krist. She tried to transfer him, but he told her not to and began giving her directions. She tried to write them down as fast as she could. Out on I-85, Buford Highway, to Norcross, stoplight at Buford and Tucker, proceed 3.3 miles from the intersection, small white house on a hill, turn left, dirt road about a mile on the right. He told her to go up there about 100 feet in the woods. He asked if the operator had got it, and she said yes. Agents from all over were called to the area so they could search for Barbara. It took them a while, but one of the agents saw a pipe sticking out of the ground and he called over to the rest of the agents. They started digging, and about 1.5 feet down, they hit the top of the wooden box. They started to knock on the box and call out to Barbara, but there was no response. They knocked again and yelled her name. After a minute, a dazed Barbara heard the noise and started knocking back. Once the box was fully uncovered, they pried it open and Barbara was pulled out alive and relatively unharmed. She had been in the box for 83 hours. Robert and Jane were still at their home in Miami, and J. Edgar Hoover personally called them and told them that their daughter was recovered alive and well. Gary Krist was tracked all over Miami over the next 2 days before being caught hiding in a swamp. He refused to confirm his own identity and they didn't have his fingerprints with them, but they knew that Gary Krist had a surgical scar on his testicles. One of the agents pulled down his pants and positively confirmed that he was in fact Gary Krist. Fingerprints would later cement those findings. The week after Gary was captured, the FBI added Ruth Eismann-Schier to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. She is the first woman to ever be placed on the list since it was established in 1940. She was finally apprehended 2.5 months later in Norman, Oklahoma. She told authorities that she and Gary got separated and she assumed he abandoned her, so she took a bus out of town. Gary Stephen Krist was sentenced to life in prison but only served 10 years. He was paroled in 1979. He went on to become a drug smuggler and went back to prison multiple times. Ruth Eismann-Schier served 4 years in prison and was deported back to Honduras, where she still lives. Barbara married Stewart in 1971, and they lived in Florida where they started a family. Barbara used her positivity to keep from letting her 83-hour nightmare ruin the rest of her life. She was placed in a grave that night in 1968, but she lived and she was determined to keep on living. The next time you stay at one of those cute little places off the highway, keep the doors locked tight, because, though you walked in on your own, you never know who might carry you out. Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases and criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.